So, I made an 8-hour video about anti-Bahia Kep1er OT8 fans. Hence begins this series, Minisodes as they will be called for obvious reasons. Summaries of my longer videos or smaller topics that don't necessarily warrant a 1 to 3 hour or even longer video. This video will be a summary of my 8-hour Kep1er OT8 video, since, well, I understand that an 8-hour video can be more than a little daunting to try and watch. I'll also include some quick updates and a TLDW at the end. I'll give a basic trigger warning for this video since I do touch on things I discussed in my OT8 video. A distilled list of warnings from the original video will be shown on screen right now. Please consume the video carefully if needed, although I will say that all mentions are relatively vague. So let's get into it. I started the video by giving some background context on, well, the content of the video, discussing what Kep1er and Girls Planet are, the history of Bahia and her family, and both her and my experiences with the show Girls Planet 999. I then discussed how much I hate Reddit's lack of a filter by oldest system on their sub, which meant I was unable to make a nice quick history of the sub and instead had to resort to scrutinizing the post history of each of the 5 mods of the sub to gain any knowledge about its history. The sub was started on October 27th, 2021, less than a week after the end of Girls Planet and the day Bahia became a member of Kep1er. The sub was started by Farina with 6 A's, who said that she hated Bahia's fans and was growing to hate Bahia too. Farina was occasionally active on the sub for a few months before choosing 2 new mods to take over from her, David and Kep1er. David turned out to be a secret Healite and Yeso-sexualizer and was purged from the sub, while Kep1er picked 3 new mods to help them and deactivated their account a few months ago after my video was released. Did my video lead to this deletion? Goodness knows, but I do wonder. Kep1er's new team of mods were made up of Alive, who has now been inactive for several months, and the final 2 mods of the sub, Irene Promoter, who is only sporadically active, and No Bullshit, who is the only remaining real active mod of the sub. The sub at time of writing this script has 747 members, and was most active between Wadada and We Fresh eras, where several posts would be made per week or even 10s per day depending on what was going on in the fandom. It was occasionally overrun by Healites who were disgusted with it. These days it is relatively inactive, although it has become more active leading up to Kep1er's disbandment, for, well, obvious, important Kep1er disbandment related reasons. Most of the sub-members are no longer active on Reddit, although there are a few who have recently joined the sub. After discussing the history of the sub, I discussed how this animosity towards Bahia and the division of the Keplian fandom in general could have been caused in large part by survival show culture, where the trainees and their fandoms go from battling it out to suddenly having to get along and cooperate, which can lead to obvious dislike towards certain members, their fandoms, etc. I brought up Eyes1 and Zerobase1 as examples of groups who have had this happen, but whose fandoms resolved their tensions over time, and brought up Hyphen as an example of a group who still has some survival show related issues to this day, alongside Kep1er. After that, I got into the bulk of the video, which was looking at claims the OT8 patrons made against and about Bahia and her fans, and evaluating whether these things actually had any evidence behind them or not. Although it's impossible for someone to not have any bias, I tried to look at these claims from a neutral perspective, considering the evidence for each side of the argument, considering alternate explanations, and considering the possibility that Bahia, in fact, could be a horrible person. Spoiler, I found no evidence for this. I started off looking at how the sub-members view themselves, and how outsiders view them, and then looked at the many horrific insults thrown towards Bahia, including but not limited to that she's ugly, a gremlin, entitled and narcissistic, stupid, unempathetic, creepy, unskilled, violent, devilish, a bitch NPC, lazy and rude, that it's disgusting that the members have to share clothes with her, and that she is a white horse. After this, I looked in depth at some of these insults, or narratives about Bahie that seem prevalent on the sub, such as that she is rude, hates the other members, is an attention seeker, selfish, entitled, and so on. As you will be able to see in my full video, I found very little evidence from any of these posts. The vast majority of them feature 2 to 10 second clips of Bahie, or even just screenshots of her in ambiguous situations, and thus they label her whatever they want to label her. I argued that these accusations were probably the result of confirmation bias, where Bahie makes a blank expression and the sub-members project laziness or rudeness onto it, where a Heolite may project sassiness or confidence. Blank expressions can be hard to understand, so we use our biases to fill in the blanks, and I don't think it's a hot take to say that most of the OT8s are probably biased to some degree against Bahie. I also tried to offer alternate explanations here. Was Bahie being rude, or was she just scared, tired, frustrated with something unrelated? Could this have anything to do with the fact that Bahie and her whole family as human beings just tend to lack expressive facial expressions and thus have to exaggerate to get meaning across? The OT8s seem to lack the ability to consider alternate possibilities. After the insults, I looked at some conspiracy theories that also float around on the sub, including ones as outlandish as the idea that all of Bahie's fans are relatives of her, one that was even turned against myself and my video, believe it or not. Other contemporary OT8 theories include the fear that Bahie will take over the whole K-pop industry with the power of nepotism, as if the industry isn't already rife with nepotism. They also include that Bahie checks the sub, and that Bahie secretly loves that her fans attack the other members of Kep1er. As with most conspiracy theories, there was no evidence for almost all of these. I then had a nice long segment looking at dancing mistakes. The OT8 sub perpetuates 2 ideas. First, that Bahie makes an absolute ton, or as one OT8 said, thousands of mistakes in the choreography. And that 2, whether because of these mistakes or otherwise, Bahie is the worst dancer to ever dance in K-pop. In this section, I looked at over 100 accused mistakes Bahie had made, and found that only around 7% of them, around 8 mistakes in total, were actual legitimate mistakes, and not just nitpicky screenshots where Bahie is in a slightly different position than some other members for like less than a fraction of a second. The number of screenshots was bizarre. Not only does a single screenshot not show a mistake, and people being out of sync occasionally is normal for different human bodies, not only were many of the screenshots followed by frames where many of the other members were also out of sync, but even better, many of the provided screenshots actually showed other members out of sync too. They seemed to rely entirely on 1, the viewer only focusing on Bahie, and 2, the viewer having a bias against Bahie to believe that she was making mistakes. One especially egregious post included 38 screenshots and proudly proclaimed that it had found 38 mistakes, of which I had a look, and only 1 was a real mistake, and that mistake wasn't even pointed out by the OP but by a commenter. So you can see that they have a great success rate. I was able to demonstrate repeatedly how ridiculous this was by finding many screenshots from Kep1er videos where members who weren't Bahie were out of sync, while Bahie was perfectly in sync. 2 other things that were common in this section were 1, treating accidents like Bahie slipping on stage as mistakes, and 2, ignoring the mistakes of other members. Every single member of Kep1er has made mistakes on stage, and some have made similar numbers to Bahie, yet the sub never said they were bad dancers. I wonder why. You know, Bahie only trained for a bit more than a year. Usually we would treat beginners with more leniency and only be harsher on professionals like Yujin and Xiaoting. But on the sub it's the other way around because, well, they're biased against Bahie. Anyway, after showing that the OT8s have no real foot to stand on when they say Bahie makes tons of mistakes, I moved on, as every discursive text should, to the other side. Heolites, or as the sub likes to call them, shitty lights. My Shitty Lights section was structured in a similar way, kind of. I looked at the insults Heolites have made against the other members of Kep1er, including barrages of xenophobic hate towards Xiaoting, to show that they too are horrible. I then looked at some posts about Heolites on the sub, which showed how many of the more active diehard ones can be generally horrible people. These included racism, sexualization of minors, objectification of Bahie herself, white savior complexes, and a lot of hatred against the other members. That said, I will mention that many of these posts also included a lot of exaggeration on the part of OT8s, where they would take a tiny little statement by a Heolite and because they're a Heolite, blow it out of proportion and say they're hating on one of the other members. Although every member of Kep1er has received hate from Heolites, the standouts are Dion and Xiaoting, trailed by Yujin and Chaehyun. Yujin because she is apparently an old hag, and Chaehyun for taking Bahie's center and main vocal positions. Xiaoting gets hate because she also took this center position, and of course, she gets a lot of racist hate for being Chinese. Dion gets hate for getting more lines than Bahie and for being Mnet's favourite. This gave me a nice opportunity to point out how, after anti-Bahie OT8s, the largest population of Kep1er OT8s are probably the anti-Dion ones, who seem most active on Twitter and YouTube, and who say horrible things like Dion doesn't deserve love. After looking at Heolites, I returned to discuss how the OT8s are incredibly hypocritical. For instance, they condemn Heolites for using racist insults, then turn around and make those same insults themselves. They say they don't use incest-based insults against Bahie, then do. They call Heolites immature, then act immature in return. They'll insult Bahie for doing something and then will praise another member for doing the exact same thing, and so on and so on. Most of all, they will keep moving the bar for Bahie no matter what she does. If she didn't stuff up a vocal line, they'll point out how she made dance mistakes. If she doesn't make mistakes, they'll point out her lackluster dancing. If she danced well, they'll move on to facial expressions, and if those were good, they'll move on to her supposed rudeness. In the end, no matter how perfectly Bahie acts, the sub will always use their supposed trump card of nepotism against her. So what's the point of even trying? Lots of them say that they would like her if she debuted normally rather than through a survival show, but I call bullshit. If she debuted normally, people would still find a way to hate her, whether for her actual skills, her personality, her fans, or whatever else. And if she didn't have rabid fans, was perfectly skilled and literally never mentioned her brother, she would still have a decent chunk of people who hated her purely because she's his sister and is mixed race. There's no winning, because if someone wants to believe that someone else is a horrible person, they'll continue to believe it no matter what the other person does. As I've said before and I'll say again, would she have less haters if she'd done everything perfectly and her fans weren't rabid? Yes, of course she would. But that doesn't change the fact that she would still have tons of hate against her for pretty much no reason. So after discussing how hypocritical the sub-members are and discussing a few miscellaneous posts that slipped through the cracks, I moved on to broader topics, starting with measuring up the accusations about Bahie against Bahie herself. My verdict? That she may well have a few issues, although I doubt it, but she is nowhere near as bad as the sub paints her. She has shown herself time and time again to be a kind, engaged, and sweet person, with respect for her elders and a hard worker. She is a pretty good singer and a great dancer and is improving constantly. The only reason she can possibly be seen as lackluster is because she is in a group full of amazing dancers and singers who will naturally outshine her with pure skill. But that doesn't mean that she herself is anywhere near unskilled. Remember that the power of comparison is big. In a group with less skilled vocalists and dancers, lots of people would be able to say that Bahie is brilliant. I think it's also worth mentioning how insanely massive her improvement has been over her time in Kep1er. She's clearly been working very hard. I also pointed out how a lot of accusations against her, like stiff dancing and lacking stage presence, are things that many idols also have. So what's special about Bahie to warrant all of this hate? In this section, I have also pointed out how Bahie, by virtue of her father's very strong German genes, has stronger features than the other members, which are often referenced by the sub to insult her and call her manly, something that, to me, could come off as misogynistic or even potentially, to some people, would be considered transphobic, since the sub has used this supposed manliness to insult her and say she doesn't belong in the group. One person even said they thought she was trans, which 1 shows how we can never know if someone's trans by looking at them, and 2 seems to go along the thought train, Bahie has more masculine features than the other members. Then, Bahie must be trans. Then, Bahie doesn't belong in Kep1er, she's too manly. Which is just deeply disturbing to me and definitely sounds like the beginning of a trans women aren't real women rant. Ew. I still find this really weird. First, why are we gendering facial features? Second, even if we did gender them, her features are only masculine in comparison to the uber-feminine features of her group. And third, even if we did say her features are more masculine, why is that a bad thing? Moving on, I discussed what would have happened if the OT8's ideal scenario happened and Bahie didn't make it into the group. I predicted that Heolites would have done their best to make Kep1er flop, and that there would still be a lot of in-group arguments, such as xenophobic hatred of Xiaoting, ageist insults against Xiaoting, Mashiro and Yujin, sexualization of Yeso, and hatred of Dion for her time on Girls' Planet. I also pointed out here that Kep1er were always an experimental group, and Wake 1 clearly never planned on managing them well. A good chunk of their lack of success compared to other produce groups is the terrible management of the company, including giving them a vague and unsolidified identity and concept, a lack of a strong concept and storyline, vastly unequal treatment compared to other groups like Zero Base 1, and even between members, picking the wrong title tracks, and releasing comebacks at the worst of times, like, literally on the same day as IVE, one of the largest girl groups right now. None of these things would change if Bahie wasn't in the group. After this, I looked at the psychology of the OT8 Reddit and of Heolites, bringing in a bunch of fun social psychology concepts like group polarization, groupthink, confirmation bias, echo chambers, savior complexes, and so on, that may have been involved in these two incredibly polarized views of Bahie. The moral of the story? We shouldn't hate on either group, but they probably both do need help, and a critical thinking education, and both groups are likely severely depressed or socially isolated and using Bahie to project. Heolites by projecting hopes onto her and using her as a self-insert, and OT8s by putting her down and thus making themselves feel better about an unattainable idol industry. This obviously doesn't apply to all of them, but time and time again we see these kinds of social psychology interactions in fandom especially and online, and they're normal human reactions and relationships, so it makes sense that they would show up here too. At the end of the video I discussed who I think is in the right, the answer being neither side, and Kep1er being the true victims of all of this. I also discussed why I made the video to begin with, to provide a systematic dismantling of the many narratives the sub spreads, and how, in 2023, the sub had started to become less and less active. I ended off with some general statements like potential ways forward, and open letters to the sub-mods, Heolites, OT8s, and so on. And yeah, that was a 2,500 word summary of my 8-hour video. Not a super short summary for sure, but considering the original video was over 78,000 words, I think I did a pretty good job cutting it down. In fact, the original video script is so large that my computer, a high-quality gaming computer mind you, starts having a bit of a heart attack whenever I open it. So now you know what my video was about. If something piqued your interest, I'd really recommend going and having a look at the section of the original video that corresponds, where you can actually see the evidence I put down and the more detailed observations and analysis I make. I did make a few factual errors in the original video, and some of my opinions have changed a bit, but for the most part I stick by the analysis I did and the things I said. I mean, at the end of the day, the message of that video is that it's unacceptable to hate on Bahie, a real human being, in such an extreme way, and I can't see that message ever changing. And now let's take a moment to discuss first, updates since my video came out many months ago, and second, some general takeaways from my original video and this situation in general. Actually, this is editing Kep1er, and unfortunately I have ended up in a situation where the Minisode is actually too long to be a Minisode, so what I'm going to do is split it in two. So this video has discussed a recap of my original 8-hour video, and the next part, which I'll release at the same time, will discuss the quick updates that I've mentioned and general takeaways from the situation. So let's go into the TLDW of this video. In this episode or minisode, I have recapped my original 8-hour long video on the Kep1er OT8 sub, showing roughly what I said and where it can be found, in an attempt to make that original video more accessible for those who, unlike me, dislike extremely long-form content. This one is just regular long-form. My original video found that there was next to no evidence for the many claims the Kep1er OT8 sub has made against Bahie, and that both OT8s and rabid Heolites are terrible and need to do better. It also discussed some fun little extra things, like tallying dancing mistakes she made, most of which were also unevidenced, conspiracy theories, also unevidenced, and the psychology of both OT8s and Heolites, which was an interesting venture. This has led to my current belief that the sub should be dedicated to hating Heolites, and that the actual hate of the human Bahie herself should be banned, since she herself hasn't done anything wrong, unless you consider her specific brand of nepotism the single worst thing to exist on Earth, like Irene Promoter seems to. So with that in mind, this is the end of this video. I'll put up the part 2 at the same time, and the part 2 will discuss both updates that have happened since and some key takeaways from my original video which may be useful to understand. So, thanks for watching, I hope you learned something, and I'll see you in the next video.